you this week? Welcome everyone to the weekly meeting of Bloomington Rotary Club. I'm Sally Gaskell, your current president, and I'm so happy to see you all here today. I'm coming from a different room in my home for this Zoom. Done my last 3 meetings from my dining room. So, you know, there's no Rotary flag, but there's some nice tulips to celebrate February in the background. So our vision as a club, for those of you who may not be familiar with us, we are a diverse, community engaged group of leaders whose fellowship and service have a significant impact, both locally and globally. So our main fellowship happens here every week at our Tuesday meetings, but we work on the service part, I'd like to think, every day. Service above self is the worldwide motto for all Rotarians. We are still meeting here on Zoom. We've been back on Zoom since the second meeting in January this year. We hope to be able to go back in person soon. We are waiting on instructions from Indiana University because, of course, our in-person location is the Indiana Memorial Union. March 1st, believe it or not, is in 2 weeks. That's a Tuesday. We're currently in contact with the IMU catering people and hope to have news for you by next week about what the plans are for returning to both a Zoom and in-person meeting, which is what we're calling our hybrid meetings. Do we have any guests here today? Let's see. I saw on the way in, I saw Michelle Gilchrist from Bloomington Health Foundation. Michelle, please give a wave.
Hi.
Lovely to see you. Great to see you. Is there anybody else who's visiting us today, either as a visiting Rotarian or as a visitor to the club? Oh,
So we have
yes, Jim.
We have Carol Kugler here with us today with the Herald Times. Carol, welcome.
Wonderful. Carol, the longtime food editor and food writer. Welcome.
Yes, thank you. I'm honored to be a part of your meeting today.
Great. Okay, I want to thank Michael Shermish, Joy Harder, out in the field somewhere, and Natalie Blaze for being our producers this week. Our roundabout reporter for this month, is Alan Barker, our president-elect. And I would like to introduce Joy Harder to give the reflection.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Well, good afternoon. This is Rotarian reporter Joy Harder coming live to you from the Rick and Joy Harder backyard on this beautiful afternoon. And please take note of my tree branch microphone because, you know, Natalie insisted that or thought it was a good idea to have a microphone. And may I also add, if you're wondering if I became inspired to be outside for this reflection on my own, by my own hand, no, Natalie suggested that I do an outdoor reflection. So ta-da, don't give me an idea because I'll usually run with it. So yay. So today's reflection from the backyard of Joy and Rick Harder was inspired because Natalie wanted me to show all of you our greenhouse that my husband built. Now, the only thing I can take credit for, and I'm still talking into my branch, by the way, is the color choices, the pink and yellow. But being outside today, being out in nature on this beautiful day, my true reflection is reading 2 poems on trees for you. Now, I am going to put my microphone down now. And one of them just flew over the fence, but I can still see it. But I want you to all be able to enjoy the trees while I read 2 poems about the trees. The first poem, and I hope you all can still hear me. Somebody say yes. Sally? Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This is a poem called Ancient Language. by Hannah Stevenson. If you stand at the edge of the forest, which by the way you all are at the moment, by way of Zoom, and you stare into it, every tree at the edge will blow a little extra oxygen toward you. It has been proven. The leaves have admitted it. The pines I have known have been especially candid. One said that all breath in this world is roped together, and that breathing is the most ancient language. And one more poem by one of my favorites, Mary Oliver. When I am among the trees. When I am among the trees, especially the willows and the honey locust, equally the beech, the oaks, and the pines, they give off such hints of gladness. I would almost say that they save me, and daily. I am so distant from the hope of myself, in which I have goodness and discernment, and never hurry through the world, but walk slowly and bow often. Around me, the trees stir in their leaves and call out, "Stay a while." The light flows from their branches and they call again. It's simple, they say. And you too have come into this world to do this, to go easy, to be filled with light, and to shine. And that's Joy Harder coming to you. Back to you, Sally, after having a fun reflection.
I'm telling you, Joy, you have, of course, outdone yourself. Natalie, thanks for the encouragement for Joy to bring to us an outdoors reflection on the trees. I got to tell you all, I think the reflection is probably one of my top two favorite things about our Rotary meetings every week. I also love the program. But thanks to everybody, including Joy, who have signed up to give a reflection over the past few weeks and the next few weeks. In fact, we don't have an opening until March 22nd, but if you haven't signed up recently, please think about it and be one of my favorite aspects of a weekly Rotary meeting. We have several Rotary birthdays this week. Today is Yolanda Trevino's birthday. Happy birthday, Yolanda. And on February 18th, we're celebrating two Rotarian birthdays, Jim Cryway and Kyla Cox-Deckard. And one member anniversary this week, and that's Jeff Bradley, Judge Bradley, 1 year in our club. We have several people who have joined during the pandemic, and we're grateful for you. I have a few announcements today. First of all, registration for the district conference is now open. So our district 6580, which is all of Southern Indiana, has not met in person for 3 years, but we're going to do it this year. I know it's going to happen. It's happening on Saturday, April the 9th, kind of right around the corner. Right here on our home base. You don't have to travel to Vincennes or Evansville or Jasper. We'll be right here at the Indiana Memorial Union. Just go to, there will be a registration link in the roundabout this week. It's $99 for 2 full meals, 12 hours of content, and tons of fellowship. There's also going to be a service project that will be headed up by past district governor and Bloomington's own Jessica Hain. So please stay tuned for details. Register now. If you need help with the registration fee, please let me know. Next week is our community service project at Hoosier Hills Food Bank. And I'm very happy to announce on behalf of Chris Michael Morrison and Tina Swanson, who are heading it up, that we have only 2 slots left for Rotarians to volunteer from 5 to 6:30 p.m. That's on Wednesday next week, the 23rd of February at Hoosier Hills Food Bank. Please do think about signing up for 1 or 2 of those final spots. And then finally, I have an important announcement from the board of directors. First of all, I've noticed as a Rotarian, I've been a member of this club for 20 years, that we look at the bylaws every 4 or 5 years and we see things that need to be changed and updated. So this is one of those years. The board of directors has been working on revising our club bylaws for the last several months. It's been a lot of work. We unanimously passed the revisions at our board meeting last month. And so later this week, I'm going to ask Natalie to send out the proposed revisions. They're in one document. You'll see the current existing bylaws plus the proposed revisions. And then during our club forum, which will take place hopefully in person, on March the 8th, we'll ask all Rotarians to vote on the proposed changes. And I want to thank Ron Barnes and our immediate past president, Ashley Wesley, for chairing our efforts in this important work. With that, how about some happy dollars? We'd like to know who's happy for the benefit of Teachers Warehouse. Is anyone happy today?
I am.
Oh, Charlotte, I'm so glad you're happy.
Yes, I'm happy because I read the book by Vonnegut.
Oh my gosh,
It's a
Charlotte
crazy,
Zitlow.
yes,
Okay, so this is our Rotary Book Club, and we're not meeting until April, and you've already
Right.
read the book. Well, I sure hope you remember it.
I sure hope I do too. But I can't, it'll be difficult because it's a crazy book and it's fun to read though. It was really a pleasure. And I listened to it. And I suggest that if anybody has a chance to listen to it on Amazon, audible.com, that it's worth waiting till the end. There's a great epilogue by Gay Talese about how Vonnegut came to New York with all those fancy writers, and he wowed the kids that Vonnegut was the favorite. He came to Talese's house on a regular basis, and the kids would all sit on the floor around him and listen to him. And he said, and this man was from Indianapolis, Indiana. And nobody could believe that there was such a fascinating person from Indianapolis, Indiana. So it's kind of fun to read.
What are you going to say? Kurt Vonnegut, native of Indianapolis. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you, Charlotte.
So that
Who
was
else is
fun.
happy? Who else is happy today?
I'm happy
Yay.
because I have only 2 degrees of separation from an Olympian.
Oh,
Sally's snowboarding cousin, Stacy. Things that Sally has not mentioned is that Stacy's mother was also an Olympian in 1984 and 1988 when she won a bronze medal as a Paralympian. I won't mention the injuries that Stacy has suffered, but I will tell you that her mother is named Martha. So 22 happy dollars. And I'll bet there are more of you that also have relatives or connections with people who are Olympians.
Oh, Martha, that is so nice. Thank you. Yeah, I should absolutely report on my cousin Stacy's triumph at the Olympics. She finished 7th in her event, but a first-time Olympian, 7th in the world. This is snowboard cross. It's an absolutely terrifying race. All of the other snowboarders were older than her. The great news, of course, is that Lindsay Jacobellis, who is 36 years old and was in, I think, her 5th Olympics. She first started out in 2006 as a 20-year-old. She won the gold. And then Lindsay Jacobellis and Nick Baumgartner from a little town in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan won the first ever team snowboard cross event. They got the golds for that. Stacy and her fellow Olympians are now back in the United States. Stacy, who is my cousin Craig's daughter, is a full-time student, maybe part-time student at the University of Colorado at Boulder. She's also a champion ultimate Frisbee player. And probably if the ultimate Frisbee competition goes to the Olympics in 2 years, you're going to be hearing from me again because she'll be on that team. So both a winter and summer Olympian, probably. And Martha Wales is right. Stacy's mom, who I've known for a gazillion years, married to my cousin Craig, has one leg. She lost a leg to cancer while she was in high school. She had been a tennis star. She grew up in Chicago. She switched to skiing and she became a champion one-legged skier and won the bronze at the Calgary Olympics. So it's quite a family. They're all from Colorado. I'm from the Midwestern gas schools. We don't ski. Well, we do ski, but not like them. I'm going to be quiet now. I too am giving $22 for Teachers Warehouse because I'm happy. Who else is happy? And going once, going twice.
Hey,
I'm happy.
yeah, hey,
Okay,
I'm
woo.
happy, Sally.
Who's that? Who's that?
This is Lance.
Lance, are you happy?
I'm very happy. I just finished the International Assembly training for district conference over Zoom. So quite an experience. Wish it could have been in person, but
Darn
it
it.
still was a very awesome event to do virtually and get together with Rotarians from all over the world. So I was in Zoom about 10 days, so I'll pledge $10 in remembrance of that.
So Lance, how long would the training have taken place if you'd done it in person?
To be over 4 days.
Wow, that's a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah,
And where were you supposed to meet?
Orlando back in January.
So
So,
sorry.
yep.
Here's to Lance. Here's to Governor-elect.
Yeah.
Who else is happy?
I am happy. My sister's closet received the first IU NAACP award for the Act to Change award from the IU students this Saturday.
Sandy, congratulations. That is terrific.
Thank you very much.
Proud of you. All right. Anybody else? I can't see you on the screen, so please speak up if you are happy. Going once, going twice, gone. Okay. This is the exciting moment of the week when we get to introduce our speaker in our program. Judy Schroeder, are you here?
I'm here. I'm invisible. I don't know why I've never had this problem before, but that's okay because the focus should be on our speaker. Perhaps it's because I first heard her on the radio. One October, I turned on the radio and it was Earth Eats. And there she was. I was listening to this woman talk about the founding of restaurants. Who, what, when, where, why. It was fascinating. And then I found out that this was our own Ruth Anna Hall's professor of history, Rebecca Spang, who also leads the LAMP, which is for liberal arts and management people to study. And her two expertises are food, restaurants, and money. Both, so you can see that and they come together in this thing about restaurants, which were the first public places where people went to be private, as she says. But hey, the proof is in the pudding. So I'll be quiet and turn it over to Rebecca Spang. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the introduction. Let's see if I can share my screen. It seemed to work okay in the preview, but there's always the moment of, all right. Does that work? Can you all see my screen? Do you see my slides? Yeah.
Perfect.
All right, so in the breakout room, somebody asked, how long has IU had a professor of restaurants? And I'm not a professor of restaurants, I'm a professor of history. I also teach about the French Revolution, I teach about industrialization, I teach about modernization, I teach about the world wars, but I happen to have written a book about restaurants. I was asked to give a short presentation. We all know that professors aren't very good at being brief. So if I seem to talk too long, or if I'm talking too fast, or if I'm doing anything else that violates Rotary custom, I hope Sally will wave me down and I can adjust as necessary. So I wrote a book about restaurants and their history, specifically in France. A new edition of that book was published in January 2020. with some fanfare, and I was supposed to go all around the country talking about the book, and my publisher was very excited. None of us were quite ready for what happened next, of course, which was that the industry just fell off a cliff. And you may have seen this graph before. In the beginning months of the pandemic, basically restaurant sales totally collapsed. It was without question the industry the hardest hit in March 2020. And happily, there's been quite a bit of recovery since then, more maybe than we would have predicted. But the National Restaurant Association says that things are far from over. There are still some real challenges in the sector. The sales are still down, costs are up. Pretty much all restaurateurs surveyed said they expect shortages of key ingredients. And overall, there are still 1 million fewer people employed in food and hospitality than there were in 2019. So the industry has really taken a hit. Something also that isn't highlighted maybe as much as it should have been, but a study in California showed that the two groups that had had the highest rate of mortality from COVID were agricultural workers and restaurant cooks. So it's, again, it's an industry that was hit hard in many different ways. So I thought that as we try to think about what the future of restaurants might be, it might be useful or at least interesting to look at two transformational moments from the past. So again, I'm going to try to talk briefly, but not too quickly, about how restaurants changed in the context of Paris in the late 18th century. This is the period that I'm really an expert in, but also Chicago in about 100 years ago, something a little bit closer to home. So as I said, in my book, I think I missed a slide there. Yes, there we are. In my book, I establish that the first restaurants, the first place called restaurants, were in fact founded in Paris in the 1760s and the 1770s. They were actually called restaurateurs' rooms, not restaurants. And at the time they were created, well, what is a restaurant? If you look in just about every European language, with the exception of German, you'll find that the word used for restaurant is very close to the French. So that suggests, I think, that restaurants really do start in France and then they spread from there. But what does the word restaurant mean? In French, it's from the verb se restaurer, which means to restore, to refresh. And what needed to be restored was somebody's appetite. You went to a restaurant because you weren't feeling very hungry. So a restaurant, restaurant, that word, in 17th and 18th century French also means a restorative bouillon. It's a dish made by sweating a lot of meat over very high heat, so it yields its juices. It's a very condensed kind of consommé, the bone broth of its day. And it was just as faddish as bone broth was 5 or 6 years ago. So faddish in what sense? Well, if we look at this early advertisement, and I'm so old that when I did the research for this book, I couldn't just Google things up. I actually had to go sit in old libraries in Paris and order up volumes of books and flip through them by page and think, is there going to be anything in here for me? So I was sitting in the reading room of the Bibliothèque Nationale, flipping through volumes of this magazine that introduced new discoveries in the 1760s. And I hit one that was a restaurant ad. And I'm sitting in this completely silent room with 500 people doing research on whatever the pressing topic they're concerned with was. And I was just bouncing up and down in my chair. I was so excited. So the first restaurateurs, you'll see, they advertise that what their goods are good for is the preservation or restoration, there's that word again, se restaurer, of good health. So restaurants are places where you go because you quote unquote suffer from a weak and delicate chest. Now, what did it mean to have a weak and delicate chest in the context of 18th century France? Right. I mean, it seems strange. If you were really that weak, why would you go out? Right? I mean, if you've got pneumonia, you aren't thinking, where am I going to go have my consommé? You're thinking, I'm going to stay here in bed and stay warm. Hope somebody brings it to me. So, and obviously, these are people who have servants. So what does this mean? So to have a weak and delicate chest in the context of the 18th century is a sign of being sensitive. And to be sensitive, or in the French is sensible, it is that you are sensitive to the world around you, meaning that you have particularly refined nervous sensibilities. Or you might even say you have particularly good taste. So to be somebody who was sensitive was something that could manifest itself in late 18th century elite society in multiple ways. Right? A sensitive person might weep at the death of their pet bird, whereas insensitive oafs, peasants, that 80–90% of the population, they weren't even so sensitive as to appreciate the beauty of birds or to have them as pets. Right? So sensitivity is a marker of class. It's a marker of leisure. Right? You might be so sensitive that bad news would cause you to faint. You would be sensitive to the beauty of nature, sensitive to the perhaps less than fully appetizing ingredients in some 18th century dishes. You would be sensitive to history and the passing of time. You'd be moved by ruins from antiquity. And one of the ways that you could manifest your sensitivity was by being, quote unquote, too weak to eat an evening meal. So while you wouldn't want to go out in public and have a cheeseburger and fries because, well, that would not be very sensitive, but you might go out to have your little bowl of consommé. So this quotation I have here from a slightly satirical guidebook from 1788 says, I don't know if you can read it if it's too little, even if he is not at all ill, a pretentious little dandy, petit maître in French, often orders a consommé in the evening because it gives him a certain air. So much as, we hear people today say, oh, I think I might have a little bit of an intolerance for this. I don't like that. It's a way of manifesting to other people how special you are. And restaurateurs were clever enough to realize that there was a business opportunity there, that you could market to people who wanted to seem special, or maybe who hadn't wanted to seem special before, but now that they could seem special by ordering a consommé instead of a beef roast, they were happy to do so. So that's where restaurants come from in a context where there are taverns, there are inns, there are places where sort of ordinary working people can get food and can get drunk. But if you want to show that you're something a little bit different from that, you need a different sort of service. And that's going to be the service supplied by restaurateurs. And they're going to supply it at separate tables. You've got a menu to order from because you're sensitive in a way that nobody else is. It's a very different model of service than what you would have encountered in an inn or a tavern. Right? So that's what makes restaurants distinctive. Not necessarily that you're unwell, but you need a special kind of attention. But, we're in 1788 here. 5 years later, we're in the most radical period of the French Revolution. Right? So a republic has been declared. France is at war with most of Europe. Many, not all, but many members of noble families, and importantly, their servants, oppose the revolution. So the restaurateurs who continued to advertise that they catered to the most sensitive people those who had the most refined taste, those restaurateurs actually found themselves thrown in jail under suspicion of being cahoots with aristocrats. So how did the rest of the restaurant industry react to this crisis? Well, they hung low for a bit. They changed their sign, so it no longer said restaurant, but maybe it just said caterer, cook. And in the aftermath of this most radical period of the revolution, they remade themselves into something that looks very much like what we expect a restaurant to be today. It was no longer about catering to the sensitive. It was open to everybody. And it was no longer about being sensible. All you had to be was hungry. And in fact, you didn't even have to be French or know how to speak French. Here are two caricatures from 1815 after the fall of Napoleon, showing us how English travelers were imagined to behave in French restaurants, which is to say they did not comport themselves very elegantly. So there's, yes, definitely some anti-English in these caricatures. So do we have time to think about another crisis? Let's try to do this really fast. Now we're going to think about the 1910s, late 1910s in the United States. So restaurants in the United States in the 1910s faced a series of challenges. The first of which, of course, come on, slides. There we go. Oh, I wasn't. There we go. The first of which is World War I. And we're all familiar with Uncle Sam. I don't know how familiar any of you are with this version of Lady Liberty. Be patriotic, sign your country's pledge to save food. So while the United States certainly did not send armies anything like as big as the European armies or the armies from European colonies in World War I, we know that US manufacturers sold an enormous amount of barbed wire to protagonists in World War I, and the US government shipped enormous amounts of food. So there's rationing during World War I, and restaurants were therefore affected. Slight problem again, advancing my slides. Come on, there we go. So maybe some of you know that Herbert Hoover directed the US Food Administration. So these that look a little bit like Valentines are Hoover cards. Although the days be wheatless, right? So there were wheatless Wednesdays and meatless Mondays. Although the days be wheatless and meatless, sweetless too, they never can be treatless. Well, I can think of you. So I think that's fairly appropriate for this Valentine week. So restaurants were affected by wheatless Wednesdays and meatless Mondays. There were then specific regulations to limit food waste in restaurants. All right. So I'd like this from the restaurant in Chicago, the La Salle, which announced that yes, they'd be serving meatless luncheons, but there will be no futurist substitutes. Right? So everything we now know today as Beyond Meat and Impossible Burgers, these were definitely not going to be on the menu at the La Salle restaurant. No freak substitutes. So actually Hoover and the Food Administration had suggested various sorts of lentil patés, mushroom patés. If any of you remember 1970s vegetarian food, sort of the era of the Moosewood cookbook, that kind of thing was already on the menu in 1917 to deal with meat shortages. There were then more regulations aimed specifically at restaurants. So there could be no sugar bowls on table, no bread supplied without people asking for it, limits to how much butter people could have, no garnish of bacon. Even American cheese is going to be rationed to only ½ an ounce per serving. So obviously this put considerable pressure on restaurants simply in terms of supply. But then there were the limits provoked by the 1918-1919 flu epidemic. Now, one thing that's interesting about the flu epidemic of 100 years ago, as opposed to the COVID pandemic, is that while many sorts of public institutions were closed, and I particularly like the headline, "Open Face Sneezers to be Arrested," nonetheless, restaurants were never closed. They were not allowed to serve alcohol. They were not allowed to have music or dancing. So there was not to be any entertainment facility. But it's important to remember that 100 years ago, things like fast food, drive-through, simply is not developed the way it was today. So it really would have put working people, urban workers, at a risk of not being able to get food if the restaurants had closed. But they could not really be places of entertainment. It was just go get your food, get out again. So that's two sources of real pressure on restaurants 100 years ago: war and epidemic. But the crisis that actually changes restaurants and how it completely transforms the restaurant industry in the United States wasn't either of those. It was instead, come on slides, prohibition. Because then is now a considerable part of the sales and especially the profit in many restaurants was the markup on alcohol. So when prohibition means that there is no longer any public sale of alcohol, of course it goes on underground, how do restaurateurs react? Some fine dining establishments responded by just raising the price of their food to the effect, which had the effect that customers, perhaps rightly, complained of price gouging. And many of those establishments closed, never to reopen, or a few managed to hold on, operating terribly in the red throughout the 1920s. And then when prohibition is repealed, managed to still be there to open their doors again. But what really happens in the 1920s is we see a whole new category of American restaurant, something that doesn't exist really anywhere in the world except as a copy of American ones. Lunch counters, diners, tea rooms, breakfast places, all the sorts of eateries that operate without needing a liquor license. So I think one lesson that we can learn from the case of the 1790s in France and the case of the 1910s, 20s in the United States is that when it comes to an institution like restaurants, not individual restaurants, but the whole category of restaurants, it's hard to tell in advance which crises are going to be transformative and in what direction. So even before COVID, I was actually really worried about what was happening in the restaurant sector because of the rise of food ordering apps and so-called ghost kitchens. I don't know how many of you know, but most food ordering apps, including Grubhub, DoorDash, Uber Eats, they charge the restaurants a considerable percentage. So that for restaurants, it can often be a losing venture to be doing very many of their sales through these third-party apps. Many restaurateurs have developed either their own online sales or say they'd rather take telephone orders. So if you're thinking about supporting local businesses, do try to do that through their own ordering mechanisms and not one of these third-party apps that's going to charge them so much. So we've seen, as I said, the growth of these apps. We've also seen the emergence of what are called ghost kitchens. I don't know if you know this phrase. These are restaurants that have no public face, that are simply places to order from. That was already a development that was growing in the past 5 years, in part because of the very high cost of urban real estate. To rent a space big enough to have 45 tables in, downtown Manhattan, in San Francisco, in Boston, in Seattle, it's just prohibitive. So a ghost kitchen is going to be a much cheaper venture. And it's also a venture where several restaurants can use the same kitchen. So you could have a breakfast place, you could have a late night place. They share the cost of the facility, but there's no there there. And a very important part of restaurants has always been that there was a there there, that they were places where, as was said when I was being introduced, where you go out to be in public, to sit at your own table, to have your own conversation, but nonetheless, you know that there are other people around you. There's a kind of fellowship in that, and also a kind of acceptance of difference. The people at the other tables don't have to eat the same thing you're eating. They don't have to have the same conversation. They don't have to look like you. They don't have to sound like you, but you're all in the same place because you all are hungry and sociable. And I do worry that if we lose restaurants where people go out and we simply have ghost kitchens and online food delivery, something very important will be lost. Thank you.
Wow, that is absolutely fascinating. Questions from the group? Who has a question for Rebecca?
Well, I'd like to ask you to tell the story that you did on Earth Eats about what happened when you first announced your interest as a history major in food, because I think it was that I laughed out loud.
Okay, thank you for remembering that. I certainly didn't laugh at the time, but it served me okay. So where I was an undergraduate, you had to interview to get into a major. And like lots of other girls, I had thought that I was going to go to college and study science. And I mean, it still happens today, but even more back in the day. I had a year as a science major. I was like, this environment is not friendly. It's not welcoming. I'm out of here. And so I went to interview to be a history major. And I said, I've always been interested in what people eat, what people wear, how they live in the present, in the past. And the director of undergraduate studies looked at me very sternly and said, Miss Spang, this is Harvard. You can't study home economics.
And you didn't, in fact.
And I didn't. And of course, all across the United States today, elite institutions, including Indiana University, are developing food studies programs. And if I were an undergraduate today, and if I had the same interests, for sure, that's what I would be a major in. So yes, thank you for remembering that funny story. I think I saw a question from Owen Johnson and from Erin Brewington.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm curious, as a historian, how did you come up with the topic of the history of restaurants? And would you categorize it as cultural history, social history, economic history?
Right. So what really drew me to it at the time, I mean, like, how did I go from being somebody who was like, wow, here's a recipe for plum puddings and it has no plums in it. I wonder why, which is sort of probably where my 18-year-old interest in the history of food started. How did I get to restaurants? I got to restaurants because in the 1990s, many historians had identified cafes as an important site for changing kinds of public interaction in 18th century cities. They said that because there are cafes and people come together, you get the beginning of a development of something like the idea of the public as we know it in modern history, as distinct from what publicity was in the early modern era of absolutism, where what is public is the king. Right? The king is the only public thing, everything else is private. So I was interested in this transformation of how you go from different ways of thinking about the public and the private. And as I said at the very end of my comments, I think restaurants are particularly distinctive as public places where people go to be private. And so that's how I got attracted to that. In terms of the kind of history it is, I called it cultural history. because it was really about changing shared norms and expectations. And I think that's culture. I think a social history of restaurants might have had more quantitative data on who went to restaurants, on who worked in restaurants. But I think cultural history has always been cultural history of the 1990s variety was always a pretty capacious category that included some people like myself, whose instincts are really more social economic history, and some other people whose instincts are much more intellectual history, even. Aaron Burrington?
Yes, so I really interested in that World War I those meatless times, and really interested in the futuristic or futurist
Ethan.
meat substitutes. What were those back then? I assume they weren't. I assume seitan or something, but not Beyond Meat, if you will. But and then how common were those in restaurants back then?
Well, what you would want to do, and you could do this online now because all of this is out of copyright. And so Google and the Library of Congress have been scanning these. Do a search for Hooverized recipes. So because Hoover was in charge of the US War Food Administration, recipes that had been modified to be suitable for the World War I guidelines were called Hooverized. And so you can find all sorts of things that are pretty fascinating. As I said, a lot of it involves using dry peas and beans. So lentils and split peas, probably navy beans. I think those are the most common dry peas in the United States. There was, again, there's a limit on dairy products. There's actually a big controversy in all of the 1910s, starting before the war, about egg prices and about dairy prices. So we probably all vaguely remember from taking US history in high school that the turn of the century is the time when there's a concern about monopolies and trust busting, and that a couple of companies like Standard Oil have gotten too big and have to be broken up. There's the same concern about eggs, that the egg trust is setting the price on eggs. Actually, the National Restaurant Association began as an organization of restaurateurs in, I think, Kansas City, who agreed that they would, this is before the war, they all agreed that they were not going to serve eggs unless the price of eggs went down. So the National Restaurant Association, which now has millions of members and is really the trade organization, starts in protest against the egg trust. So the 1910s is a really fascinating period for this industry. Leslie Green.
Yes, hi. So you identified the start of the first restaurant, which, you've kind of defined here, and it began in France, but certainly there were public houses, there were inns, there were all kinds of things before that. So how did, what's your take? I mean, what's your historical knowledge on that, and how this sort of break or establishment of this new type of entity was somehow important? It sounds like it was rather elite.
Right. So the crucial difference isn't what they serve or even who they serve, but how they serve it. So in inns, taverns, pubs, you might have to go to the bar to place an order. There might not be a printed menu. In the inns of 18th century France or in the cook caterers, the format is what we would think of as quote unquote family style. Everybody sits down at once, all the food is put on the table, you pass it around. And if you know each other and you're all a big family, that's great. But if you're just two people and you go and you sit at a table that's got 16 people and the other 14 aren't talking to you and you're stuck at the corner beside the pickled beets and you don't much care for pickled beets, then that kind of service might not really be the ideal business model. So what restaurateurs do and what then gets mimicked everywhere in any place called a nice restaurant is a place where you sit, quote unquote, at your own table and you order your own meal from a restaurant, from a menu. And you could have it at 6 p.m., you could have it at 6:30, you could have it at 7. You don't have to have everybody there at once, which is the model of the inn meal from an earlier period. So it's the real innovation, as I said, isn't what they serve or even who they serve it to, but how they serve it. And now I see a question from Charlotte Zitlow.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, my question is a shift, and that is the history of the cookbooks. I'm very interested in how cookbooks have developed, and they've become my favorite reading.
Right. So cookbooks are totally fascinating. And I agree. They're some of my favorite things to read as well. Cookbook, manuscript cookbooks have a very long history through the Middle Ages. And if you think about the kinds of recipes or prescriptions that, I don't know, somebody like my great-great-grandmother on a farm might keep, there would be, a chicken feed and what to do when the dog gets attacked by a skunk and a good recipe for biscuits, right? So it's sort of a mix of household hints. And then most historians would say that this develops in the late 18th and then really in the 19th century. We get cookbooks being broken off from these other kinds of household hints, though often with household hints being a separate section of it. Now, one thing that's interesting, and again, other people have done much more work on this than I have, is the difference between fairly lavish cookbooks published by trained chefs, most of whom for the 19th and much of the 20th century are going to be men, and cookbooks written by women. And here, very important category in the United States are the cookbooks written for immigrant communities. So the Settlement House cookbook, the Fanny Farmer or Boston cookbook, these are really cookbooks that have both some recipes from what were then the major immigrant groups. So people from Italy, people coming from Italy, people coming from Central Europe, from Germany, from what is now the Czech Republic, people coming from Ireland. So dishes that they might want to be able to make, but faced with what are the ingredients you can get in the United States in 1900. But also these cookbooks are serving a sort of pretty important, I think, cultural fusion melting pot function, because you see recipes that maybe were written with some other population in mind, and they go, I don't know what that is, maybe I'll try it. And then, of course, there's a whole fascinating category of cookbooks, which are the charity cookbooks produced. I don't know if the Rotary Club ever produces a cookbook. No, Rotary Club doesn't, but churches and synagogues certainly do. And I have really good recipes from the cookbook produced by the Dallas Junior League. I've never been a member of the Dallas Junior League, but I picked it up at a yard sale, and there are great recipes in that cookbook. Timothy Jessen.
Rebecca, before we get to Tim's question, would you be able to stay after for a few minutes to answer a few extra questions?
Yes, I can stay for another 5-10 minutes.
A couple minutes. Okay, thanks. So Tim, we're going to put you off until then. Hopefully you can stay. Thank you so much, Professor Spang, for being with us and enlightening us on all of these really fascinating and fabulous pieces of information. In honor of your talk today, we will be making a donation to Cardinal Stage.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. So Elaine Barker, over to you. Could you tell us about next week's program?
Thank you very much. And let me just bring it up here on my screen. So next week, still on Zoom, which is maybe 1 or 2 weeks left before we move into our hybrid mode. It's going to be the past district governor, Jessica Hain, who we all know very well. She's absolutely amazing. And she will be speaking about Rotary's current presidential initiative, Empowering Girls, and what we're doing about it here in Bloomington. So that should be a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. Let's close our meeting by reciting the four-way test +1 together. Of the things we think, say, or
Say
do.
or do.
First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? Fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned?
And fifth,
is it fun?
Gotta ask.
Thank you all. See you next week.